If you enjoy this podcast, look out for my new book, Mondo Documentary. It compiles short essays on hundreds of documentary films. Judd Apatow says it's required reading for anyone who loves nonfiction cinema. It's not on Amazon, but you can order it anywhere in the world from purenonfiction.net. Filmmaker Petra Costa has spent the past 10 years documenting the shifts of Brazilian politics. And what she reveals has a lot to say about the United States. I'm Thom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. In 2019, Petra Costa released her film The Edge of Democracy, that traced the rise of Brazil's authoritarian leader, Jair Bolsonaro. It was nominated for an Oscar. Afterwards, Petra realized there was more to this story. She had witnessed evangelical Christians help get Bolsonaro elected, and then how he used his power to destabilize democracy, set back environmental causes, and endanger vulnerable communities. Petra watched in 2022 as Brazil voted Bolsonaro out of office and democracy was tested once again. There were riots in the nation's capital that were an echo of what happened in Washington, D.C. 2 years earlier. That's part of the story that Petra tells in her new film, Apocalypse in the Tropics. Later in the episode, we'll hear from Petra's producer, Alessandra Orofino, who brought her experience from the worlds of activism and political comedy. But we start with Petra. I interviewed her via Zoom from her home in Brazil. At the time we were speaking, on September 1st, Bolsonaro was going on trial for attempting a coup and other serious charges. He was eventually convicted. I wanted Petra to look back 6 years ago, when The Edge of Democracy came out on Netflix and Bolsonaro was still in power. I asked her to recall how Brazilians responded to the film.
It was a very intense reaction. First, because I think no documentary was as widely seen in Brazilian history. I know it was seen by 2 million people in the first month, and then I know it was the second most watched documentary on Netflix that year. So I think definitely more than 10 million people saw the film by the time it was nominated, and so it provoked so much reaction. Also because most of the Brazilian media had portrayed a different version from the version I'm telling in this story. Most of the establishment was in agreement with a narrative that Dilma should be impeached, that she did commit crimes, and so did Lula, and that Moro was the judge, a kind of savior of the country. And it was not until the international press started to report on what was happening that we started having different perspectives. So this film comes a bit as a cry, like a held cry from half of the population that was not agreeing with the way what the facts were being portrayed by the press. And and then when it is nominated, Bolsonaro is already in power, and he criticized the film. He says that I'm a traitor of the nation. He uses the official Twitter of the Secretary of Communication to attack me. One of his Senate congressmen asks for my prison, so there's a huge attack, and an attack that would then prove itself to be part of like a series of attacks that he would do with female journalists. I mean, I'm not a journalist, I'm a documentary filmmaker, but he probably puts us in the same bag.
What was that like for you?
It was horrible, horrible because it was the moment. It was the day almost the day the film was nominated, and so it was a moment of celebration. That suddenly I'm trending topics in Twitter, being attacked by a horde of a digital army, in the most horrible ways. So yeah, it was intense.
In 2020, just a few weeks after Petra attended the Oscars, the world shut down for COVID. I wondered if she knew right away that it was time to make a new film.
Actually, I didn't. I had a few friends who were like, you have to continue filming. And making Edge of Democracy was so exhausting from a psychological perspective and physical as well, that I couldn't even, I had nausea just of thinking of that possibility of continuing. But then what happened was in March, so a month after the whole career of Edge of Democracy finished, the pandemic begins, and in April I'm already itching to film because we're living through the worst sanitary crisis of our history with the worst president in the world in the command. Um, and 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 it was just a surrealist nightmare. And I immediately felt like I had to film, and I have a photographer who had worked with me in Edge of Democracy, Murilo Salazar, who was like, we have to film," and he's and so we started filming, and he started filming mainly in a favela, in the biggest favela in São Paulo, in Paraisópolis. And as soon as the material started to come back, it was clear that that the evangelical presence, both in helping people where the state wouldn't help, but also in spreading misinformation that the virus would be cured by Jesus and things of that sort, and keeping churches open, was something that was the most fascinating thing that was coming out from the material that we wanted to investigate. And so I invited the producer Alessandra Orofino to work with me, and we together made this decision. And together we just she suggested we film Malafaia, and we did, and it was really a great decision. It's this this televangelist, who's the protagonist of the film, because at that moment he was just one of many allies of Bolsonaro, and with time other allies would die, including of COVID. And he became the most important ally.
The televangelist Silas Malafia is a central figure to Apocalypse in the Tropics. We'll hear more about him later. In order to enter the world of evangelicals, Petra had to give herself an education on the Bible, and especially the book of Revelations. She told me this was largely new to her.
I grew up, I mean, in my house, yes, there was no religious upbringing at all. On the contrary, there was an aversion towards Catholicism. But when I turned 14, I fall in love with Buddhism as a philosophy. So when I find in the Bible many principles that are very similar to the Buddhist principles of compassion, of selflessness, and of understanding the illusion of the self, of the ego, um, and therefore how you are the other. And that fascinated me, both in the Bible but also in the Gnostic Gospels, where that is even clearer. And what also fascinated me, for me, reading the Bible was almost like learning the language that you're always hearing but you're not understanding. It's like there are things like that, right? That once you understand the term, you reassess many things that you grew up hearing but you didn't know how to decipher. And so Bosch, Marx, Bergman, most of Western art is shaped by the Bible in so many ways that I only then was able to read. The book of, just to speak about one book, right? The book of Revelations that is the focus of the film. That book is so present in so much of, I mean, the ones I cited are all have works completely related to that book, which for me is one of, I mean, it's a fascinating book. Um, it's almost like the horror film of the Middle Ages, right? That embodied the minds of most Christians, through those paintings that we portray and depict in the film, that tell so much, that are so cinematic, uh, and and that have probably led to so many nights of nightmares. I mean, the first night that I bought a book of the apocalyptic paintings, Christian apocalyptic paintings, I couldn't. I mean, I had nightmares the entire night with those images. And so we decided to make one of the layers of the film be populated by these apocalyptic paintings, and to be um, and that was an idea from David Barker, who was one of the editors of the film, for the film to have this dialogue with paintings, as we were talking about Christianity. And there's such a, even though of course evangelicals are non-pictorial, we're talking about paintings that are talking about the same books that they're using. So we gave ourselves that poetic license. Um, and for me it was fascinating, because it's what's moving the actions of today. If we speak about politics as it is unraveling both in the United States and in Brazil, the far right is completely inspired. The Christian nationalists are completely inspired by a certain reading of the book of Revelation, which is the premillennialist reading that believes that the end of the world is looming and could possibly even be accelerated the more chaos is created. And I didn't know, I had no idea of that. That per se for me was almost like out of a book of science fiction. The idea that you could have people today working to accelerate the end of the world.
As an American watching this, I can't help but notice the parallels between Trump and Bolsonaro, and I wonder what you make of those parallels.
Well, yes, Bolsonaro has often been called the Trump of the tropics. And what is fascinating is that the feeling that some of us have right now is that Brazil was, throughout most of the time that Apocalypse in the Tropics portrays, Bolsonaro was imitating Trump in everything. And he was also being tutored by Bannon to do so. After the election, Bannon, who in 2018 said that Lula was one of the biggest threats to his anti-globalist movement, then in 2022, after Bolsonaro loses the election, meets with Bolsonaro's son and says, do not accept the result of the election, contest it until the end, which they do. And then the Bolsonaro supporting crowd invades on 2 days after, January 8th, 2 years later and 2 days after, the three branches of power, and destroy them. The difference, though, is that here the police welcomed them in. The police did not resist, which is one other frailty of our system. Here the military and the police are very aligned with Bolsonaro. But what has happened since then, I think, is an example of what a democracy does when it's working well, which is that the institutions in Brazil were able to respond quickly to these threats, this coup attempt. And Bolsonaro is now on trial. His trial starts tomorrow. He and some of them, one of them a general for the first time in Brazilian history, will face trial for a coup attempt that, if successful, would have killed Lula, his vice president, and the Supreme Court justice. And he will most likely go to prison this year. So that's why some people say that Brazil might be the first country to be able to defeat this modern wave of fascism with its current threats, which would be amazing. A very happy ending to this story, but we know it's not that easy.
During the time that you were making this, you could not have foreseen that there might be anything hopeful about what was going on. And I wonder how you carried that over the years that you were making this, without a strong indication that it was going to turn out well in any way.
Yes, during most of the time that we were filming, the sensation was that or Bolsonaro would win and name, as he promised, a majority in the Supreme Court, reshape the Supreme Court to have a majority. So it looked like our democracy was really going towards its end. The fact that Lula regained his political rights and won the election by only 2 million votes in the end was almost miraculous. But then, yes, as you saw, the police tried to interfere with that election and not allow people to vote. They printed a coup plan in the president's office. That coup plan that said that would kill Lula, his vice president, Supreme Court justice, was printed in Bolsonaro's office. And this coup was only not successful because one top general was not in agreement with it. Otherwise, most were. So it was for very little that it didn't happen. It's all still very fragile. I say of a possible happy ending, but we're not counting with how Trump will react and try to meddle with our election, which he's already trying to do. I mean, with the absurd tariffs, with the Magnitsky law against the Supreme Court justice that is taking Bolsonaro to trial, a law that was created to precisely punish people like Bolsonaro, people who threaten democracy, but is actually being used to punish the people who are punishing those who threaten democracy. So it's an inversion of the term, as the far right tends to work always with inversions, right? Where they want to they're calling the Brazilian democracy a dictatorship, and they want to topple that dictatorship to impose a real dictatorship. They say they're defending freedom when they're actually defending the return of a dictatorship. And it's always these inversions. Malafaia, who now became also, last week, our film had many updates because last week Malafaia was indicted by the police. And because the police had access to Bolsonaro's phone, and they leaked audio messages, giving instructions to the ex-president of how he should react to the tariffs. How the Malafaia says, you should say that you're only going to convince Trump to drop the tariffs if they give you amnesty. That is, if they forgive your crimes and do not put you on trial. And he tells Bolsonaro, record a video now asking the population to support you and attacking the Supreme Court. And Bolsonaro says, I'm going to try, but I'm in the middle of a hiccup crisis. I can't not have a hiccup every 10 seconds. So you see everything that we kind of portrayed already in the film, which is how Malafaia was kind of a puppet master, mentor to Bolsonaro, and how Bolsonaro is really like this frail puppet, which some Brazilian journalists criticized us when the film came out, saying we were giving too much importance to Malafaia. But now these audio leaks show that even the federal police agrees with us.
Given that Brazil's democracy was able to withstand such a strong attempt to overcome it, I wonder if you see any lessons from what Brazil went through that people in the United States should study to as we feel an attack on our democracy.
The hard thing is that one of the greatest defenders of our democracy currently is the Supreme Court, but that you can't change, right? I mean, that is built over time. But what I don't know how progressive lobbying groups pressure the Supreme Court. But clearly, in my research of the rise of Christian nationalism in the United States, there's so much money that was put by the far right into pressuring the Supreme Court against Roe versus Wade, etc. The focus of the Christian nationalist movement was, since its inception with the moral majority, the Supreme Court. So looking attentively, right, at the Supreme Court, I think, is lesson number one, and with all the difficulties that entails. But they should be pressured to really defend the Constitution, which is the reason why they exist. Other than that we really can't take democracy for granted. Like the process of stopping a wannabe dictator from becoming a dictator is through the courts and through the streets day by day, but mainly through the courts than through the streets. And there's still time for that in the United States, to put more and more pressure on it through the courts, and I think and through the Congress, and so the midterm elections will be crucial, and there's no moment to fall asleep. You're in a very crucial moment where if the right actions are not taken, it might die from one day to the other.
That was Petra Costa, recorded in September. A month later, I spoke to her producer, Alessandra Orofino. She grew up in Brazil and got her start in activism. While living briefly in the United States, she got hooked on the comedy news shows of Jon Stewart and John Oliver. She brought that style of humor home, co-creating a comedy news series that ran on Brazilian HBO for 7 years. As we start our conversation, Alessandra tells me how she came to admire Petra's work.
Petra is one of these very rare artists, and particularly in the documentary world, at least in Brazil, where she can combine two things that are so hard to combine, right? Like, she has this very strong voice as an artist, and her films are beautiful, beautifully shot, beautifully written, very personal, there's just like this really, I've always been a fan since Selena. I just love her work. As pieces that have her voice and tell her story in such strong ways. At the same time, she can be extremely political, so she can talk about things that touch upon the lives of millions. And she can also reach a mainstream audience. I mean, The Edge of Democracy was watched by 10 million people in Brazil. So that is an unusual combination. An artist that can be both like connecting to a mainstream audience, telling stories in a personal and highly kind of, artistic way, and also touching upon political themes. Like, how do you get that? So I was always attracted to that, and felt like she really had something special going for her. And I think conversely, she would watch my show, and she knew that we were doing this, and it was such like a new way of, and I come from this kind of weird like political background, but I also work with media. Like, it's also an unusual profile. And I think she wanted a producer, writer for Apocalypse, before it was Apocalypse. When she started shooting, she was essentially shooting the pandemic. It was the early days of the pandemic, and she had all this material on the pandemic. It was maybe like April, like very early days, but she had been shooting since March, like the heart of the lockdown, all of that. And then I think maybe late April, she contacted me. She was like, Ali, I have this thing that I think should be a film, but I don't know what the film is yet. And I need someone to work with me that can both like help me produce. She was pregnant too, so she knew that she would need help. Help me produce, but also, like lead on the production side, but also have like the creative / political / access side. And I think it should be you. So we watched the material together. And I think and together we found that the most interesting story being told was not about a pandemic. It was about religious fundamentalism, because in those early days that was everywhere. Like people were praying on the streets, they were dropping on like sidewalks, the churches were fighting to stay open in spite of lockdown orders. Silas was going nuts and like saying that, you know, the Supreme Court was disobeying whatever, like that they had a constitutional right to remain open and crowded. So that was, and there were seeding doubts already on like masks and then vaccines. So saying that Jesus could cure COVID. So there was like this kind of, and at the same time, many religious leaders were also responsible for keeping their communities afloat. They were the ones like feeding people who were going hungry. They were the ones organizing community-led ambulance systems in favelas where, you know, normal ambulances don't even come in because of whatever. So they were playing this very interesting role as organizers, as community leaders. At the same time, it was such an interesting paradoxical moment. So we and that was all in the material. So we said, okay, this is the story. The story is politics and faith.
When I hear you talk about your comedy background, I think about there are many years in the U.S. when The Daily Show, The Colbert Report, John Oliver did feel like they were leading the culture and penetrating the culture in a way that documentary often wishes it could. I would look on with a degree of envy as a documentary supporter that, boy, maybe these comedy people are, they're killing it. So I wonder how you were riding that wave, and how did you see like the world of documentary film and, what Petra was doing? Was it doing something different?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've always been a documentary buff. I love docs, so that is one thing that you should know. But I guess like the main difference is that in terms of process, is that when you're doing, well, with comedy, timing is everything. Like a joke can be very funny today and not funny at all tomorrow, or feel kind of used and dated in a week. So the shelf life of these products, particularly comedy news, because it's so related to whatever is hot right now, is very short. So you reach a very large audience, and it can be quite powerful, but short shelf lives, right? And also short time frames for creating these shows, these scripts, these pieces that go out into the world. Because again, if you want to be funny, you have to be funny before someone else is funny on Twitter. It's true, and I think that's only gotten, there's nothing worse than a joke that you've heard already. Like it's awful. So you need to be the first one to tell it. And with comedy news, there's the news element of it that is also like puts you in that kind of crazy cycle. So I was for many years producing a show that is, again, a weekly show, which meant very short time frames, and getting that together and putting it out. And in one way, it's very satisfying because you see the results, you see the impact, you see the audience reacting to the thing that you made immediately. And I would look at documentary filmmakers like Petra and go like, you are crazy. You spent years on something, and then you finally release it, and then you have the audience feedback, and there's nothing you can do about it if the audience reacts badly to the thing that you did, because there's no new one coming out next week. Like you have to wait another couple of years. Like that is crazy, right? It felt crazy to me. But in a way, though, that's also the power that he has, right? Like when you look at Petra's films, you can see the years that went into it. And that gives you, as the audience, a very different experience, right? Because you can really reflect. I think that time frame, the time frame of Always On, is not great for reflection. It can be very good for, again, impacting public opinion as it moves and changes. Yeah. But it's not good for making people really sit back and think and digest. So when I think about the process of the show and the process of the film, they were parallel, right? Like I was shooting the film and running the show at the same time for years. The show ended when we were already doing post for the film and editing the film. But as we were shooting, I was doing the two things at the same time. And the way I think about it is like with the show, I was like shepherding an audience through the thick of it, through the thick of the political turmoil, through the thick of the pandemic, like helping them our own small way, but helping them find a path to kind of even like survive the craziness, right? Like, how do you then laugh a little bit, understand a little bit, go this way, go that way? With the film, which is only now out, years after we're filming, it's very different process. When I see people, audiences reacting to it, when I go into screenings, particularly in Brazil, what I think we're doing is helping people look back at what they just experienced the last few years and make sense of the full story, make sense of the full narrative. And again, you can't compare these two things, different kinds of impacts, but I wouldn't say that one is more impactful than the other. I think those are completely different processes and both have a place in the culture, and we need to fight for them to exist because they have a role.
So in the making of Apocalypse in the Tropics, my understanding is, between Petra and you and maybe another correspondent, you were kind of dividing responsibilities of like what you were going out into the field and shooting, particularly with the main evangelical leader. Can you kind of break down for me, who was out there in the field?
We had so many people in the fields because, again, like a lot of the shoot happened during the pandemic. So we had to have small teams and minimize travel. So we would have local teams often. Like in Manaus, we had a local team, and neither Petra nor I went to that shoot because it would be 2 airplanes, right? And that was just not possible. So like, how do you minimize exposure to your team at the same time? How do you keep your eyes open and fulfill our duty in many ways to document, right? So that's how we felt about it. I'm happy to say that we didn't have any incidents in terms of COVID, et cetera, with the team. Like the team was healthy and protected, but it was definitely a worry. With Silas, the main character, the person who introduced us to him was a reporter, Ana Virginia Balussier, whom I knew already, and she had been covering evangelical leaders for a while, and she already had a relationship with him. She had already interviewed him, and I always thought that her interviews were the best ones. Like she really got more interesting things out of these leaders than other reporters. So she did the first interview without us. We just asked her to ask him for an interview, make clear that it was for a documentary film that she wasn't directing, it wasn't her film, but tell him all about it, but then just go herself. As a way of like, breaking the ice a little bit. So she did that first interview, which I don't even think appears in the film. And then we started introducing the team and going, etc. And Petra did a few of those interviews and followed him a few times, and I did a few as well. And because he is based in Rio and I'm based in Rio, often, particularly for like crowd situations where often it would be me kind of following him. It was fascinating. But we also had moments in which neither of us were there. And for instance, one of my favorite scenes in the whole film is the one of him in the car, where he fights with the motorcycle driver. It's like, Jesus was not a peaceful man, like something around those lines, right? And he's, essentially rage driving. I love that scene. I think it speaks to so many aspects of his truths and his view of the world. And that was filmed by a cinematographer, Pedro Urano, who was amazing. And he was on the backseat. And there was no one else in the car with him, just him and Silas and his wife and him in the backseat. And often when we would film with Silas, I would do that. I would, be with him, interview him, etc. But then as we were moving from one place to the other, I would ask someone to just quietly sit in the car or like something where Silas knew that, of course, it was a camera, but where he would just like let his guard down a little bit and not be in interview mode. And that I think yielded some of the most interesting pieces. It was actually not the interviews. It was just him being him.
I think there's like a subtext drama in the film of how he interacts with the camera or whoever's in the room, because he comes across as someone who's extremely media savvy, and isn't likely to say something that he doesn't mean in front of a live microphone, and yet understands that the people who are making this film come from a different political perspective, and yet either has the confidence or or a recklessness about what he's saying. I don't know how to read it, but I'm throughout the film I'm kind of leaning into wonder what is he thinking and trying to accomplish interacting with this film crew. I wonder how you think about that.
Yeah, so a few thoughts on that. The first one is that all of Silas's interviews, all the people who were actually leading the crew, interviewing him, etc., were young, like relatively young women. So it was Petra, it was me, it was Ana Virginia at times. And Ana Virginia looks a bit like me, like kind of short frame, curly hair, like very kind of girly. And I think that was part of it, honestly. I think that the fact that we were these relatively young women, and that comes across like you would sometimes look at the camera and say, "Oh, sweetie," or like things like that. And that was so common. That was how he would address us. And even though he knew exactly who Petra was, he knew who I was, like there was nothing coy or, covert about it. Particularly because I'm used to liability with my comedy. Like I knew exactly what kind of release we needed to have from him. So we never hid anything. But I think he just saw us as fundamentally non-threatening because that's just who he is, like he would never look at me and be like, "Oh, you were a threat to my empire." So I think he genuinely believed that he could, use us in many ways. And he tried, right? And he believes the things that he says. So that's that's one aspect. One aspect is the kind of gender power dynamic, which made him in many ways, I think, underestimate us. And I think that's part of the reason. Then the second thing I would say is that he believes the things that he says. So he's proud of, I would say, 90% of the things that he says in the film. It doesn't mean that he agrees with the things that we say or the things that we show, but the way that he is portrayed, I think, is very faithful to what he actually is. And I believe he wouldn't disagree. And knowing him quite well now, I think I have, a good sense of what the part that he doesn't love is the part towards the end around January 8th, because that's an active investigation by the federal police in Brazil. And a month after the film came out, he was included in the investigations, and the federal police report cites a scene in the film as the reason to include him. So he knew from the moment he saw the finished product, he knew that that piece was going to be the most problematic piece, not because of what he says. I mean, he says what he says, and he believed those things, at least at the time. I don't think he doesn't believe them now. I mean, he still is supporting Bolsonaro, etc. But I think he kind of knew that the consequences of that could be greater. So he had more of a problem with that piece. But gender, then he believes those things. And then the third dynamic, which I also think was part of it, is that he didn't necessarily realize that we were making a film about power, about the leadership, not about the faithful. And often during our shoots, he would be encouraging us to kind of bundle him up with the faithful, with the people in his congregation. And we were very, very careful not to do that. We did not want to make a film about what drives someone to the evangelical faith and whether or not it is wrong to have that faith or to believe in those things, or like, oh, they're manipulated. Like that was not the thing that we wanted to do. We wanted to do something, we wanted to make a film about power and how political power uses religious authority and vice versa, how religious leaders use political power and yield political power. And that dynamic, that who is using whom dynamic, was fascinating to us, and also is the thing that we as citizens can and should be concerned about. I think people's faith, ultimately it's their thing, it's their private decision. And I don't think he expected that. I think he expected a film that he would have an easier time publicly saying that he hates and that he was victimized. I don't think he ever expected a film that was good for him in the sense of being saying that he's a hero, because he knew where we stood politically. But I really do think that he expected something that he could use as a platform and go see, these leftists, they are prejudiced against the Brazilian population and the faithful. And he couldn't really say that because that's not what the film that we made. So for me, the biggest proof that he really truly hated it, not in a performatic way, but truthfully, is that he never spoke about it on social media. So we showed it to him. He in the movie theater. I rented a room just to show it to him. I was there with him and his family as they watched it. We had a discussion afterwards. He wasn't happy, but then he never made a video about it. And if he wanted people to watch it, he would have gone online and said, oh my God, I've been scammed, like these crazy,
Right.
like whatever. And he never did that. That would have been
Right.
great for our marketing, but he never did it.
Talk to me about the political moments that Brazil is having right now. As this film comes out, it's been, from my perspective, a radical shift from the time when you were filming. You're filming Bolsonaro, feels
larger than life.
Yes, and now he's been convicted in a court. So how are you experiencing this moment of the film coming out?
On the one hand, as you know, Bolsonaro has been convicted to 27 years in prison. He's still under house arrest, but we have every reason to believe that he will go to jail soon. He can get elected again. It's not impossible that decision will be reversed. And there are already calls for amnesty in the Brazilian Congress by Bolsonaro's political groups who attempts to essentially cancel or pardon, commute his sentence through an amnesty bill. So, and that has lost some momentum now, but it could regain momentum in the future. So I wouldn't count on that being a permanent decision because these things have a way of coming around. However, what can be said is that he's lost much of his power, not only because he lost the 2022 elections, as we show in the film, but also because since then he lost a lot of his clout with his own base, right? Like Bolsonaro was not defiant. I think that is also a place where he differs from Trump. Even though they share so many characteristics, there are many in which they differ. And one of them is Bolsonaro was truly afraid of going to jail. And you can see it. It's so transparent. So when he had to testify in front of the Supreme Court, which he had to do, he was not going like, jail me if you will. It wasn't a, this is my mugshot kind of moment. It was, I am so sorry. I didn't know what I was saying kind of moment. If he felt like a wretch. And I don't say this because I don't like him. I say this because I think that's how he was read by his own base, right? Like it felt cowardly. And there was a thing that Sila says in the film where he says, a leader stays, a leader faces the consequences, and he fled. And that theme of he flees, is a coward, he doesn't actually stay and fight, that has been permeating a lot of his political presence in the past 3 years. So I think he lost a lot of the respect that he had. And the Bolsonarista movement, though, is still strong and electorally powerful, but he will channel its energy towards a different leader, I would say. So that is the situation now. And we don't know who's going to be the heir of that movement in the 2026 elections, because we do have elections next year, presidential elections. So that will be an interesting thing to watch. Until recently, Lula, his popularity was not good. It's improved somewhat thanks to the Trump tariffs, because it kind of created a bit of a rally around the flag, not unlike what you had in Canada moment. But in your case, that happened right before an election, which ended up creating a lot of rejection for the far-right candidate. In Brazil, it happened a year before. So I don't know how much of that political capital will still be available for Lula in October 2026, which is when the elections will happen. So, it's a bit of that moment. The churches, though, remain powerful, and Lula didn't really do much to really curb the influence of religious fundamentalism in politics. Mostly, I think, because it's not his style. Like, Lula is not a confrontational leader. He never was. He really believes in, let's make room for everybody. And, these things will, and I personally think that politics has changed so much, and the way the information environment works has changed so much that is less and less powerful as a solution. But that's his solution. That's his background as a negotiator. We have to remember that Lula started his political work as a union organizer, right? That's what he does. So that's a situation. Now, what was interesting and we didn't see coming is that by the time the film was released, the debate around religious fundamentalism in politics had really exploded and continues to gain importance outside of Brazil. In many different countries, we're seeing religious fundamentalism play a bigger role in political life, and scripture of different kinds of faith be used as the basis for political decisions. And that is true in India, that is true in Italy to some extent, that is true in Hungary, that is true in Israel, and that is definitely true in the United States. And I think the religious fundamentalists surrounding the Trump administration and the way that they've instrumentalized the faith and the movement that happened and gained strength after the death and the assassination of Charlie Kirk, I think all of those elements were not expected, were not things that we expected, but they're so apparent. So outside from the conversation in Brazil itself, we really do hope that the film can spark some reflection on audiences in other countries. And often it's easier to have a conversation about whatever it is that is happening in your own country through a mirror, through someone else's problems, right? Like, it's because it's easier to talk about someone else's problems and then make the comparison than it is to talk about yours, particularly in these highly polarized environments. So, that is a hope that we have for the film, that the impact will resonate beyond Brazil.
I want to thank producer Alessandra Orofino and director Petra Costa for speaking with me. Their film, Apocalypse in the Tropics, is now streaming on Netflix. You can also watch Petra's previous film, The Edge of Democracy. If you need a holiday gift for a film lover, look up my new book, Mondo Documentary. Nelson George says it's like a giant wish list of films you can't wait to see. You can order it anywhere in the world, but not on Amazon, only from purenonfiction.net. Thanks to our team, Doc Voices writer Bella Racklin, series producer Hannah Nordenswan, and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphael Nehausen. I'm Thom Powers. Follow us on Instagram and visit our website at purenonfiction.net.